For 40 years, sports scientists couldn't agree on one basic jump training related question. Can you actually change how much fast twitch fiber you have? Some studies said yes, some studies said no, and some said that only certain directions worked. Even textbooks contradicted each other. And some coaches were actually creating entire training methodologies based on the wrong answer to this question. Even worse, some athletes were told don't even try jump training or sprinting because you don't have the genetics required to do it well. The reason coaches, textbooks, and researchers were all disagreeing was because they were actually measuring the wrong thing. Once these researchers figured out how to get these measurements correct, it has changed the way we think about type 2 fibers completely. So if you've ever been told that you don't have the right genetics or you have the wrong build to jump high and be a freak athlete, then this video is good news for you. And the reason why is because the science that we grew up with on fast twitch fibers was wrong. Now you guys may have heard of this athlete, Werner Gunter. He's a prolific thrower, and the reason why he's interesting is because when they actually did a muscle biopsy on his vastus lateralis, they found that he was predominantly a type 1 athlete. 60% of his muscle fibers were actually type 1 slow twitch fibers. But through 15 years of power training, after reassessing his fiber type composition, they found that he actually had more type 2 fibers than he had type 1 fibers. In reality, the cross-sectional area in his muscles was made up of 70% type 2 fibers. So let's go back to 1976 and figure out exactly where we went wrong. A researcher by the name of David Costille completed a study where he compiled a number of elite athletes across different sports. He does muscle biopsies and he looks at their muscles under a microscope, and what he finds changes the way that we think about sports performance for the next 40 years. Elite distance runners have 70 to 90% type 1 muscle fiber composition, and elite sprinters have 80% type 2 muscle fiber composition. And untrained individuals sat right in the middle of about 50-50 slow twitch to fast twitch fibers. And this conclusion gets pasted into every single sports science textbook for the next 20 years. You're either born a sprinter or you're born a distance runner, and you can be a better distance runner or you can be a better sprinter, but if you really want to be elite, you have to have the right fiber type composition. This dogma changed the way that coaches trained athletes and how they selected athletes to do specific sports. And it's not too dissimilar from the way that I was actually raised. When I was about 10 years old, my family looked at me and they said, "John, you will never be a world-class sprinter, you'll never be a world-class jumper, you'll never be in the NBA because you're not explosive enough. No one in our family is explosive, no one in our family is fast, and therefore you have no chance at this. Go ahead and just hit the textbooks." In the 1990s, the cracks started to appear in this dogma. Studies started being published where they started to see slight shifts towards more fast twitch fibers and slight shifts towards more slow twitch fibers after training. But other studies occurred in the same populations with the same protocols where there weren't shifts in muscle type composition. So the field was split. Half the researchers said, yes, you can definitely change slow twitch into fast twitch fibers, and the other half said, no, what you're born with you have and you cannot change it. Both sides had data, both sides had the explanations, and neither side could come to an agreement. So for the next 20 years, this disagreement just sat there. Coaches ended up picking sides that fit their philosophy. Strength coaches believed you could increase the number or the size of those type 2 fibers. Endurance coaches said, no, what you're born with you have and you can't get more type 1 or type 2 fibers. And honestly, the science and research wasn't there to resolve this problem until one researcher finally figured out what was going on. And it wasn't the training, it was the fact that the scientists weren't measuring the right way. In the past, researchers would pull muscle biopsies out of the athletes, stain them, put them under a microscope, and the fibers that appeared white were considered to be type 2 fibers, and the fibers that were dark stained were considered to be type 1 fibers. They'd count the amount of each of these fibers, and that would be the percentage of type 1 to type 2 fibers. It sounds pretty simple, but there's something that people didn't appreciate for decades. And that is that muscle fiber typing is not categorical. In reality, they don't live in little neat boxes where you have type 1, type 2, type 2A, or type 2B. These muscle fibers live on a continuous spectrum. And it actually turns out that a huge number of these fibers, in some muscles, 20 to 40% of all the fibers, express multiple myosin types at the same time. These fibers are called hybrid fibers. So a fiber could be part type 1 and it can be part type 2A. The muscle fiber could also be part type 2A and part type 2X. It can even have all three of the fiber types at one time. And the old staining methods were never able to identify this. It ended up forcing every single fiber type into one neat box. So if a fiber ended up being 60% type 1 and 40% type 2A, researchers would just label it a type 1 fiber, even though 40% of that fiber was considered to be fast twitch. Now I want you to think about what this means. If you train for 8 weeks and a bunch of your type 1 fibers end up shifting to a hybrid fiber of type 2-1 and type 2A, your fiber composition has genuinely changed. Your muscle is now expressing more fast fast twitch fibers than ever before. But under the old measurement method, it would have just been considered an entirely slow twitch fiber. So you would have looked at that data and just concluded that that was that and nothing changed. Two studies could measure the exact same biological changes and come to two very different conclusions, strictly based on the technique that they used to measure the fiber type composition. And this is why the field disagreed for 20 years. Half agreed they could change and half agreed that they couldn't. In the early 2000s, researchers actually developed a better way to figure out what fiber type you are. They learned that if they isolated a singular muscle fiber and measured each one separately using a method called the SDS page electrophoresis, they could see exactly how much myosin type you had in each individual fiber. This allowed them to finally identify these hybrids and see how much of them you actually had. And when the field re-examined a lot of these protocols and studies using this single fiber analysis, a much cleaner story emerged. The disagreement completely disappeared and people started to agree on one thing. And this is what we now know about fiber type changes in athletes. The first is there seems to be a fast to fast shift. When you train heavy in deadlifts, squats, cleans, all the things we do here at THPStrength, type 2X fibers will shift towards type 2A fibers. This happens within weeks and it's not really disputed. The reason why is because yes, the type 2X is incredibly explosive, but it also fatigues very quickly. So when you start training consistently, these type 2X fibers quickly shift towards type 2A fibers, which are slightly slower but do not fatigue as quickly. This is also why a lot of bodybuilders have a ton of type 2A fibers. It's because through massive amounts of training volume, their type 2X fibers have shifted to type 2A fibers. The second thing they found, and this should excite every single vertical jumping athlete, is that slow twitch fibers can shift towards fast twitch fibers. In 1994, a researcher by the name of Jesper Anderson did this single muscle fiber analysis. He looked at elite sprinters before and after an 8-week period of sprint training, and the numbers were remarkable. Pure type 1 fibers dropped from 52% to 41%, and type 2A fibers rose from 35% to 52%. And the hybrid type 2A and type 2X fibers ended up shifting more towards type 2A fibers. That is an 11% shift from slow twitch fibers to fast twitch fibers. And these weren't untrained athletes. These were elite athletes who were at the absolute pinnacle of what they could do in speed power performances. And the shift wasn't small. It was a measurable, statistically significant change in muscle fiber composition in just 8 weeks. But the study that matters maybe the most for you guys is a study that came out in 2005 by our friend Malisu. And I've covered this study before, but as you guys know, a number of athletes performed thousands of plyometric reps. Hurdle hops, bounds for distance, bounds for height, counter movement jumps, squat jumps, 24 sessions over roughly 10 to 12 weeks. And the reality is that the slow twitch fibers actually decreased by about 1%. The type 1 and type 2A hybrid fibers actually increased by 3.1%. The type 2A fibers improved by 7.2%. And the type 2A and type 2X hybrid fibers and type 2X fibers decreased by 4.4% each respectively. So pure type 2A fibers went from 33% of the athlete's fiber composition to 40%. That's a 7% absolute increase in those fast oxidative type 2 fibers. These fibers produce the most powerful sustained contractions. And it's also the fiber type that jumping athletes want more of. Now those type 2X fibers went from 7% to 3%, but you should view this as a training adaptation and upgrade to those type 2X fibers. Through repeated explosive work, they were able to become more fatigue resistant. So while the type 2A, type 2X hybrid fibers dropped by about 5%, the hybrid type 1 and type 2A fibers actually tripled, going from 2% to about 5%. The whole fiber population shifted toward a more type 2A dominant, fast oxidative phenotype. In other words, jumping 5,200 times across 10 weeks made a measurable change in their fiber type composition. The muscle wasn't just neurally adapted to jump higher, the actual fibers changed. More fast twitch proteins, more explosive fiber expression, and a more jump-shaped muscle. But there's one more finding from this research that I have to tell you about, because it's something that a lot of world-class jumpers have experienced but maybe haven't put a name to. you. And it's called the type 2X fiber overshoot. Here's what happens. When you train hard, your type 2X fibers end up shifting towards type 2A fibers. The muscle fiber becomes more fatigue resistant, but overall you lose a little bit of explosiveness. But then we do something called a taper. You back off training for about 14 days and something very interesting happens. And that is that the type 2X percentage does not return to baseline. It actually rises above baseline. You temporarily have more pure type 2X fibers than you ever had before training. Researchers have measured this in the single fiber studies, and after heavy training and a taper, athletes will show an increase in the expression of type 2X fibers. This lasts for a brief window of time before returning to normal. And this is also the molecular basis for why peaking works so well. So when you peak for a max effort vertical jump or competition, you're not just neurally fresher. You're not just recovered better. Your actual muscle fiber composition has shifted to a temporarily faster, more explosive expression. And for that brief window, you will have more purely fast twitch fibers than you've ever had in your entire life. This is how we end up hitting PRs during deloads and tapers. And it's why the right taper starting the right day is so important. In high school, I actually saw this happen going into my junior year. I had trained immensely hard for 6 months and ended up getting a high ankle sprain. After a rough period of 14 to 21 days, I came back out onto the high jump apron and jumped a 2-inch PR the first day back high jumping after not practicing for 21 days. Jonathan Edwards, the world record holder in the triple jump, also had an interesting phenomenon happen to him. But there is something that I have to be honest with you guys about because I don't want you to get burned out by not seeing these results happen in your training. These fiber type shifts do not appear to be unlimited. The studies they're looking at take place from 6 to 16 weeks, and the maximum amount of change seems to be around 5 to 15%. So if you're born with 30% fast twitch fibers, you're probably not gonna end up being Usain Bolt, but you can be a way better version of yourself. There was another fascinating study where they looked at 2 identical twins, where one had trained for decades in endurance training. And when they did his muscle biopsy, they found that he had 95% type 1 fibers, and his sedentary, untrained brother had 40% type 1 fibers. That's a 55% difference over decades. So over a long enough timeline, it seems like these changes can be massive. As you guys know, I also have an identical twin brother who has done endurance training for over a decade, and I have done power training for almost 20 years. And the differences between us are significant. I've tested my max vertical at roughly 40 inches, and maybe on my best day, I've been around 43, while my brother has ran a marathon in under 2 hours and 25 minutes. Now, if I went out and ran a marathon, I probably wouldn't even compete. And if my brother tried to test a 43-inch vertical, he would probably end up around 33 inches. So these fiber type shifts appear to be real, and they are specifically in those hybrid fibers. So what do you do with all of this information? So first, we know that heavy strength training changes the muscle fibers at the cellular level. When you clean, when you squat, when you jump, you're gonna see type 2X fibers shift towards more type 2A and type 2X hybrid fibers. When you clean and you jump and you squat, you're gonna see those type 2X fibers shift towards type 2A fibers. But in reality, you're building the underlying proteins that help you be more explosive. It isn't just neural, it is an architectural change to the individual sarcomeres and the fibers that make them up. And secondly, high velocity work seems to be important to shift slow twitch fibers to fast twitch fibers. Heavy, slow lifting alone doesn't seem to cause as much of a shift as very fast lifting when it comes to type 2-1 fibers moving towards those type 2-1, type 2A hybrids. Doing ballistic work like sprints, plyometrics, and ollies is gonna be better than just doing heavy, slow, grindy reps. This is exactly what we do at THP. We use all of the different means and methods to improve force across the entire continuum. We use super heavy eccentrics moving relatively slow, and then we use very fast ballistic movements like plyos and ollies where the concentric RFD is insane to allow these fiber shifts to happen optimally. And lastly, you need to periodize your training and taper appropriately. We know that these type 2A fibers can shift towards type 2X fibers where you see an overshoot mechanism where there's more type 2X fibers than you had before training. And we know that those type 2X fibers are crucial when it comes to breaking world records. So you need to have a periodized plan where you go through a number of mesocycles, optimizing your force, power, and muscle architecture, and take advantage of that taper to maximize those type 2X fibers and the overshoot mechanism. If you guys are interested in coaching and you want to know how to get more type 2 fibers, then go to THPStrength.com. It's what we specialize in. It's what I've mastered over the last 20 years and what I've obsessed about every day of my life. Right now, if you sign up for the annual plan, it is actually 50% off. I implore you, it is the best way to maximize your type 2X fibers. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope this is interesting, and I'll see you next time.